So now let's talk about one of the most popular features of PHP, arrays. PHP arrays are just plain awesome. They are inspired by Perl. They're called associative arrays. Perl had associative arrays, and what happens is part of what programmers have to do is you have to write algorithms, which is code and steps that you write through, and then the data. And so you solve problems with a combination of the logic that you use and the data that you create. Data structures are how you shape the data. And in a language like C, they had this thing called, structs, which are shaped data items. In C++, you have objects, which are shaped data items. Java has an object, which is a shaped data items, and a data item that has a shape. Those are all really complex ways to, with lots of syntax to say, oh, this person has a first name and a last name and a phone number. And arrays, associative arrays, are key value pairs. So you say, you know, this person has a first name and a last name and a phone number, and you're done. And so they're just a way for programmers, without learning a bunch of extra syntax, to create data structures where they hardly even know it. And so that's what Python dictionaries are very popular, one of the most popular features in Python. Java has things like hash maps. Windows has things called property bags. They're all a version of an associative array or a key value pair. PHP arrays are probably my absolute favorite. When I move from PHP to Python, I'm like, oh, dang it. I want these things to stay in order. So PHP arrays are just my favorite associated arrays. In PHP, they can either be like a list, a linear list indexed by numbers, or they can be key value pairs like first name Chuck, last name Severance, phone number, blah. And they have two-dimensional arrays, but they're really just arrays within arrays of arrays, basically. We'll talk a little bit about that, but not too much. So you can make an array that is a linear list of things. So here we're going to make an array. So this is sort of a constructor that says make me an array that has two things in it. And like most civilized languages, the first element is in sub-zero. So we use the sub operator or index operator or item operator. So we say, give me the sub 1, which is actually the second one. And so we print out there. So we make an array, and then we reference an item within that array. Unless we tell it otherwise, it just puts these things in at 0 and 1. The thing that people really love, though, is when you do key value. And so this is the syntax. Let's make an array. And I read this as maps to. So this key of name maps to the value of Chuck. So this is the key and the value. The key, of course, maps to web applications for everybody. And then you can use the index operator again to go look up the piece under the key course, and out comes web applications for everybody. I love this. I love it. I love it. Sorry. I'm like a fan of key value arrays because, like I said, it allows us to build data structures without thinking too much about it. Although later when we do object oriented, like, see, you don't want to get so complex with your data structures using arrays, but that's okay. So there's a couple of ways to print these things out because we start building shapes. So I mean shapes of data and conventions. You're the one as a programmer, you decide to call it name or course or whatever, but after a while you make these shapes, and this is a super simple one. So you want a way to print this stuff out. Print R, and I'm going to put a pre-tag out so that the new lines don't get all messed up because that's HTML for a pre-tag, so that I see that actually the way it prints out, so it doesn't do line wrapping on all this stuff. So print R goes through this array and prints the key and the value, key value, and goes through it. You'll notice that the order is the same both when I put it in and when I take it out. That's one thing that I like. The R in print R, I think, stands for recursive, which means you have an array within an array within an array. It'll kind of go through that, and they'll indent even further and further and further. This is very simple, but you can print out much more complex structures. And you do end up with very complex structures. Sometimes you have a linear array with integer keys inside of a key value array, especially when you start talking with APIs and JSON and stuff like that. So you want to print it R. Another thing that is even more verbose and detailed because it talks more about the type is a thing called var dump. Var dump is, I think of it as lower level. It's less pretty, but it's more explicit. And what this says is this $stuff is a 2-item array, and the first item is name maps to a 5-character string of the value of Chuck. Course map is a first key that maps to a 5-character string SI664. So it's just a little more verbose. And I tend to use var dump when I'm really digging through something because prinr makes it prettier, but sometimes you lose some detail. The one thing I love about var dump is that you can actually print false. You can actually print false because var dump is printing both the type and the value, right? So here I have false is in thing. I print out 1. I use prinr, and it's absolutely nothing. And this is like, shh. I'm so mad because I look at this and I say the code didn't run. But it did. This code did run. So when you print false, it doesn't show up. Have I told you that before? Again, that's because I am really usually angry after like 20 minutes of wasted time because I keep printing stuff out and I can't see it. But then I realize I should have watched my own lecture and used var dump because var dump says it's a false and it's Boolean. There's a reason it does it this way, I'm sure, but it's not very convenient for debug printing. Now you can construct an array a couple different ways. You can start with an empty array and append stuff to the end. So this is make me an array, and then this is go to the end and add 1, an item, and then it just adds these in integer positions, so 0 and 1, so it's a linear list. You can do the same thing with key values. You just put the index operator on the left-hand side of the assignment statement, make an array, stick Chuck under the key name, stick WA for E under the course, order, smiley face. Stays in order. Okay, looping. So this is looping through a key value array. And so it's this looping construct that has 2 iteration variables. For each, syntactically different. The array is the first parameter, and then as is a keyword. And then you can have 2 iteration variables, one for the key and one for the value. And so I read this as for each stuff as key maps to value. That's what you put right there. It's not a less than or a greater than or equal. It's a map to. That's like, I think of that as an arrow, right? And I think that's exactly what the design of the language was. So this loop is going to run, and K is going to go through the keys, V is going to go through the value, and then the next time through the loop, they're going to both simultaneously advance. And so it's I think this is really, really pretty syntax. I think that's really nice syntax, and I like it. I like being able to loop through arrays. If you have a linear array, you can get at the key and the value. In this case, the key is 0 and 1, because that's how this works. This is the 0 position, that's the 1 position. You can also, on a linear array, you got to be careful that it's a well-formed linear array, you can use a counted loop, right? So count is a function that tells you how many things there are. So in this case, that's going to be 2, because there's 2 things in there. So I'm going to have an iteration variable for I equals 0, I less than count. So that means it's going to be 0 and 1. Sub 2 wouldn't work because this is an array sub 0 and an array sub 1 there. So and then I'm going to add 1. So this is a counted loop that's going to run twice. It's a little uglier syntax-wise. For this particular thing, I would have used the for each instead. But you can do counted loops. Sometimes you actually need a counted loop because you need the variable I for some reason or another. And so then you just kind of dereference stuff sub I, which is the 0 and the 1, and then the loop prints all the stuff out. So that's a counted loop that's going to iterate through an array. Just talk briefly about 2-dimensional arrays. They're not really 2-dimensional arrays. They are nested arrays. They are recursively nested arrays. So you can put an array within an array, right? And so this is outer array. So this is the outer array, and this outer array has 3 things. The first one, the second one, and the third one. And this paper maps to an array. See the comma? The comma is part of the outer array. So there are 3 things in the outer array. So you can think of this as product subpends. Product subpends is going into this outer array and grabbing this thing. And then submarker is within this array grabbing submarker and looking up markers. So that pulls out markers. So it's not really 2-dimensional arrays, it's array within arrays. And you won't build this structure often if you're going to get data from a database maybe, or you're going to get data off the web or something, read some JSON and parse it or something. You'll get this, and then you'll just have to figure out how to dig into it, how to go in and dig through this whole thing. And so that's arrays within arrays. That it's kind of like 2-dimensional arrays. So up next, we're going to talk about how there is a set of functions that help us build arrays and search them and do various things.